Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and today I would like to talk about a concept that both Lacan and Žižek use, which is known as anticipatory identification. And I would like to give you a step-by-step guide as to how you might be able to use this idea to think about what kind of a life you would like to lead, what kind of a dream you would like to pursue, and in so doing, to take these highly technical and abstract philosophical and psychoanalytic ideas and make them something that you can apply to your own life that will hopefully be instructive. I'm going to be giving you some easy to understand examples, but I'm also going to explain step by step the more theoretical components underlying the problem of symbolic identification, which Žižek also refers to as precipitous identification. In fact, let me begin by giving you a simple formula according to which Žižek designates the problem of identity. He writes, within the space of symbolic intersubjectivity, you can never simply ascertain what you are. So, your objective identity is established by means of subjective anticipation. Now, that's a fairly technical explanation, but what he's really trying to say is that you will always face the question, who am I? And the problem is that this can never really be answered directly. The question, who am I, is also the question, who am I to others? Therefore, the question, who am I, becomes, what am I? And this is the problem of identity for Žižek, which is to say that who you are is a signifier, an object of meaning that has to be staged to others so that you might retroactively prove it to yourself. And Žižek argues, drawing upon Lacanian psychoanalysis, but we can also see these themes, for example, in Kierkegaard, that this causes anxiety within the subject. It is the burden of opportunity, or responsibility, if you will, that you could be anything, but you don't know who you are or who you'd like to be. And this is what Žižek calls the problem of anticipatory identification. Or, to put it in simpler terms, how to find your dream, how to think about who you would like to be. That is going to be the topic of this upcoming lecture. But before I begin, if you're new here, welcome. And if you are a returning member of our learning community, welcome as well. This is a weekly live stream lecture dedicated to making complex and technical philosophical and psychoanalytic ideas more easily accessible. If you'd like to support this project, as well as download the edited transcripts, ebooks, and accompanying audio downloads, please consider becoming a patron. Thank you so much. So I want to begin with an easy to understand example that I recently came across reading the One Piece manga, specifically the first couple of volumes where the characters are still finding each other. And there's a wonderful sequence in which the author actually explains something in the little text before the chapter. And he says, one of the central themes of One Piece is that the characters all have a dream that they're chasing. And it's a dream that is so important to them that they would rather face death or risk death than give up on their dream. After all, to give up on their dream would be to face a life, if you will, a curse, a burden, worse than death. Which is to say, within the universe of One Piece, for any member of the crew to give up on their dream would be to choose a fate worse than death. This also means that by embracing their dream and going all the way, risking everything, they actually live a meaningful life. They know exactly who they are because they know what they're willing to die for. And there's a beautiful scene early on in which the swordsman, whose dream it is to become the greatest swordsman, faces off with Hawkeye who is considered the greatest swordsman alive. And he's clearly inferior to this master swordsman. And yet he nevertheless continues to fight him, saying, "This is my dream. I don't want anything in life other than the best you." And there's a moment of inversion that takes place here, where Hawkeye suddenly realizes that he's not simply fighting an idiot who fears nothing. Instead, he is fighting perhaps the only person who believes in swordsmanship as much as he does. And therefore, Hawkeye spares Zolo's life so that he can spend 20 years training to then come and battle him again. And here we have a beautiful moment where real recognizes real, where two individuals who have committed themselves to a dream recognize that sincerity in each other and recognize each other as authentic individuals. It's a beautiful example of how within the One Piece universe, the problem of precipitous identification, precipitous being a synonym for dangerous, actually becomes a really life-affirming theme throughout the series. That if you choose to give yourself completely to something and go all the way, that is when you actually find a life that is worth living. Whereas to take a step back and to simply become a passive consumer who does nothing, who safeguards themselves, who tries to live a life that is comfortable, is actually a way of missing out on life. In fact, here Žižek has an interesting argument, if I could briefly have an aside. Žižek says that the problem of anxiety about identity is universal. Who am I? What am I? And who am I to others? And yet, within contemporary capitalist consumer societies, the answer that is given to you is to say, well, you can forestall this problem by being a consumer, by being an individual with lifestyle options. Instead of doing something with your life, you can simply buy your way into happiness. You can signal to yourself, and perhaps more importantly to others, who you are by means of your consumptive, i.e. lifestyle choices. And this means that you buy fancy things to convince other people that you are a certain type of person, but really you're just trying to convince yourself. And there's a certain emptiness here, a certain sadness that takes root when you're living as a consumer individual, when you're not really willing to go to the mat for anything, when you don't stand for anything. Your entire life project is to signal to other people that you are successful and happy and perhaps even immortal, signaling to other people that you do not age, that you do not suffer, that you have a perfect, meaningful, blissful life, which is to say that you are not an individual, but you are a god. Therefore, the contemporary capitalist mantra is, do not assume the burden of identity, but simply signal to other people that you have a lifestyle. Lifestyle is therefore a way of short-circuiting or forestalling the problem of identity. You don't actually have to think about what it is you want to be, as long as you can prove to other people that you are a certain type of person. Like, once I have this type of watch or this type of car, I will have made it, essentially. And this can be quite satisfying for a while, but it also remains empty. It creates this weird temporal loop where you have to constantly find something new to prove to others about yourself so that you might potentially believe in it yourself. If I only pretend to be happy enough, I will become happy. If I only signal wealth, I will become wealthy. Against this, we have what you might call symbolic identification. And what's really important here is that symbolic identification within Lacanian psychoanalysis is not identification with some object of meaning, which is to say symbolic identification isn't I'm wearing a shirt with a logo on it, therefore I am X. Instead, the true formula of symbolic identification is that you identify with a kind of death, with a kind of nothing, that you give yourself completely to some dream, some ineffable X, something which by definition can never be completed or never filled in. Which is to say, if you are a quote-unquote object for the other, i.e. a signifier for the gaze of the other, through which you stage the gaze of yourself, then the best way to live is to find a dream, some ineffable X, that encapsulates the full multitude or expanse or infinity of possibilities according to which you might live. Let me give you a brief example. Let's say for a moment that you look in the mirror and you appear to see yourself. Here I am. What you're really seeing is the idea of yourself in terms of how you appear to others, which is to say you have encountered the gaze. And the gaze is therefore always anticipatory of the gaze of the other. Here is how I might be perceived by other people. This is also true for speech, by the way. When you speak, you are always anticipating how other people might interpret that which you are saying. Which is to say, both on the visual level of the gaze and in the speech act on the level of enunciation, you are always already the very object of enunciation. Which is to say, in advance, a priori, you're anticipating the gaze of the other, or the other as interlocutor, and you are articulating or formulating yourself in advance for that internalized gaze. Which is to say, what Lacan is arguing is that the gaze doesn't emanate, strictly speaking, from the other, but that the gaze is its own other. The gaze of the other is therefore not, strictly speaking, how other people look at you, but how you have already internalized in advance the fact that you will be looked at, the fact that you will be heard or interpreted. Now, you cannot evade this by simply saying, I don't care. In fact, I think this is one of the traps that I see in a lot of online self-help, saying you should care less about how other people perceive you. Because this doesn't get to the crux of the issue. The issue isn't how other people see me. The issue is how you imagine yourself always already to be perceived by the gaze as such. You could be by yourself or standing in front of a mirror and you externalize yourself to prove to yourself that you exist. In fact, a form of torture is to take away every sensory identification so that you can no longer exist. Your very presence, therefore, is always signified back to you by some refraction, by some redoubling of identification. Therefore, to truly be free is not to be free from the gaze, but instead to become the master of the gaze, to truly embody or identify with the object of the gaze, which is you. Now that's a little bit abstract, so I'm going to try to give you another example here. Žižek puts it in the following formula. The fundamental form of symbolic identification is to recognize yourself as X. And what he means by X is a master signifier, something which comes to represent you to yourself. For example, to go back to anime or One Piece, Zoro wants to be a swordsman. That is his entire dream. Therefore, his X is master swordsman. Luffy wants to be pirate king. Therefore, his X is pirate king. You look in the mirror and you say to yourself, what I want to be is X. And this X, therefore, becomes a stand-in for the problem of identification as such. It becomes your dream. And when you are able to make yourself subject to your dream, then you actually become alive. And here Žižek points out a paradox, which is to say, and I will cite him here, by identifying with the symbolic, you essentially render yourself dead, but also make a claim to posterity. Now, what he's arguing here is that when you identify with this X that signifies back to you who you are, an X of your own choosing, then this means that you are murdering yourself, in a sense. You are making yourself into a pure signifier. You're no longer a real person, you are X. And yet, it is at this very point of identification with X that you truly become yourself, that you are able to access and enter into subjectivity. By means of identifying with your dream, suddenly the entire world opens up to you, and you can be a full, autonomous, free subject. Which is to say, you have to assume the burden of responsibility of choosing your own dream and not simply taking somebody else's prepackaged dream and making it your own. Not simply embracing lifestyle, but instead really saying, what is it that I want to do with my life? I have a certain amount of time that is left to me. I'm still young. I'm the youngest I will ever be. And what is it exactly that you want to do with that time? That is ultimately the freedom, but also the burden of responsibility that each and every one of us faces. What is it that I want to do with the time that is being given to me? You cannot choose the time in which you live, but you can choose what you do with that time. Time and temporality is therefore something that is integral to the idea of will and freedom. In fact, Lacan here has a really interesting example, almost a metaphor, if you will. It's a logical example in which he points out the temporality of identification. To put it somewhat simply, Lacan's basic argument is that if your identity, who am I, what am I, to whom am I, what is the object which I am to myself and to others, this means that there is always an anticipation of recognition, and this anticipation therefore creates a temporal dimension. And the example that Lacan has works like this. There's a prison master who has 3 prisoners. And he's allowed to free one of these prisoners. And he comes up with this elaborate mathematical test. There are 5 hats, 3 of them white and 2 of them black. And the 3 prisoners are put up in a triangle facing each other and are given a hat, which is to say, the prisoner who guesses correctly which hat he is wearing, a black or a white hat, is allowed to go and free himself. This means that the prisoners are looking at the hats the other prisoners are wearing so as to logically deduce which hat they might be wearing. Now, there are essentially 3 ways in which this can go. And it's hard to explain, so you have to bear with me. I might make a mistake. The first one, the first situation, is what Lacan calls the instant of gaze, which is to say, you're sitting as a prisoner, participating in this experiment, and you look at the other hats, and one of them is black and one of them is white. And you know that there are only 2 black hats. At which point you think to yourself, okay, if I'm wearing a white hat, then the black person knows already which hat. Okay, actually, you know what? I'm going to read out. Can I just say briefly, I've worked on this for like 10 minutes trying to figure out what the easiest way to explain this logical problem is. And every time I did it, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. So let me simplify this problem. There are 3 situations here. 1, a prisoner looks at the other hats and is immediately able to deduce that he has a black hat. And so he gets up. Here we have instant logical recognition. Then we have what Lacan calls time. I wrote it down here. Time for, oh my goodness, I can't read my own handwriting. Time for interpretation, which means that there's an ambiguous situation in which the prisoner has to think about what the other prisoner is thinking. And because he cannot deduce for certain which hat he is wearing, he has to understand that if the other prisoner is not getting up, then he is the one who will get up. The third situation is what Lacan calls the moment of conclusion, and this is the most interesting one. This is the one in which all 3 of the prisoners are wearing white hats. And this means that if they are all of equal intelligence, there will be a moment in which they have used the delay of interpretation to understand that they are all potentially free or potentially unfree, at which point they will all get up at the same place, at the same time, look at each other, and realize that now they all have white hats, and whoever gets to the door first is the winner. The reason that Lacan introduces this, and I can put a longer description of this, if you will, in the description to this video, if you really want to work through the logic of it, is that Lacan says that there are always three ways of identifying with and through the other. There's instant recognition, which is simply, I see someone and I recognize who they are and who I am. But then there's the anticipatory gesture of trying to figure out who I am to the other. And finally, there's the moment of conclusion, the zero-sum logical conclusion of pure identification. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you go to a protest. One of the problems that people often have with protests or marches is they say, well, nothing is accomplished. They don't have clear demands, and at the end of the day, they go home, but nothing has been achieved. Ergo, the protest was unsuccessful. However, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of Lacanian symbolic identity, and let's be clear, Lacan was not pro-protest, but from the standpoint of symbolic identity, the moment of mutual recognition is when you identify with identity as such. Or, to put it more simply, when you go to the protest, you say, here's what I believe in, and you are surrounded by other people who believe in the same thing. Therefore, your belief has been enacted and magnified and essentially in some way enacted. And this belief in belief as such, which within Lacanian psychoanalysis is therefore to identify with identity as such, is actually something that is profoundly emancipatory. It can actually change our reality. Case in point, if you look at US politics last week, we have the beautiful juxtaposition of the military parade that took place in Washington, D.C., which was meant to signify master signifier identity of patriotism, nationalism, militarism, etc. And yet which failed to do so on some fundamental level because of the lack of enthusiasm when it came to the symbols. One of the key problems, I believe, of the Trump military parade was that there was a strong absence of these signifiers, of nationalist imagery. Instead, we had branded watches that were being touted and UFC logos and Palantir ads. Therefore, the sort of weird corporate militaristic synergy failed to identify with identity. It failed to identify with the ineffable X of patriotism, the nation, sacrifice, all these things that are bigger than oneself that entice populist support. Instead, there was a real absence of these images and these objects of fealty, which made the parade surprisingly ineffectual as an object of soft fascist or neo-feudal worship. Against this, the No King parade, if you will, for that was what it also was a massive show of belief in belief, identity with identity. Not the touting of specific demands, but the creation of a master signifier, which was the act of participation in its own right. People were there to show that they were there, to show that they were not alone. Therefore, when you participate in this type of a march, solidarity as it were, you are demonstrating both to yourself and to others that you are not alone. And here I think we have a really important part of symbolic identification. Symbolic identification is never simply you and your dream against the world. It is also you realizing that what ties you to other people, that what makes you part of a collective is this dream. Therefore, it's not the individual the hyper-individualistic, isolated, alienated person who has a dream. After all, here we have a fundamentalism. You could argue that the shooter who took out Democratic lawmakers last week had a dream, as it were. But that's not a dream, it's a paranoiac, psychotic fantasy. Instead, the true dream is therefore to have a dream that gives your life meaning, but that through that meaning allows you to access reality and be with other people and to have meaningful interactions with the world and with others. This is why having a dream is such an important way of giving yourself license to be. In fact, that is the theme that I would like to end on. Without making it too technical, I want to say that the whole point of overcoming anxiety, who am I? What am I? To whom am I what? Is to find license to live, to find a reason, an animating motive that allows you to keep on living, that gives you license to lead a meaningful and rich existence. And this is why it doesn't really matter what your dream is. Like, it doesn't matter if it's one thing or another. It's about giving you license to do interesting things with your life. And this could even be in a relationship. I truly believe that if you have a happy, loving relationship, it's about giving each other license, encouraging each other to grow and to try new things. Everything becomes more enjoyable. Like, you could be eating by yourself and it's fine, but if you're eating with another person, it becomes delicious. You could be watching a movie by yourself and it's funny, but you could be watching it with another person and it becomes hilarious. This is the essence of what it means to be a human being. We need each other. The problem of identity is therefore its own solution. Yes, it's anxiety-inducing that you are an object to others, that you are subject to others. And yet this is itself the key, the staging ground for your own existence. And so don't run away from this. Don't run away from other people. Run towards other people. Live with abundance and empathy and grace and poise and dignity because you have a dream. And the dream is what allows you not only to have license, but to have meaning in your life. And that is the problem, but also the solution of anticipatory identification, which is to say, the anxiety that is incurred by the question, who am I, can only be solved by saying, who am I to others? Who are we together? And it's not just about leading a life of service in which you give yourself completely. It's about finding something that is so precious to you, that you hold dear so much, that you can be a joyful, giving, caring, abundant human being, someone who is at peace with themselves. And I truly believe that a life that is predicated solely on consumption and lifestyle gives us the illusion of happiness, but makes us feel at war with ourselves. There is something that remains ill at ease, stuck. But if you have a dream, if you have something that you really want to do every day that gives you a reason to live, not something you have to do, but something you get to do, then you become a better person. Then you become capable of love and grace, and you're unclenched. And that's what I want for you. That's what I want for everyone. That's what I want for myself. And so this is a video meant to give you some of the technical terms that hopefully can help you unlock that in your own life. That would be the ultimate goal for me, the ultimate idea of success for this video. Thank you so much. I hope that this video has been helpful in some ways. And I'll try to make some more videos if I have time. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to be part of our learning community, if you'd like to support these videos, consider becoming a patron. I shall see you very soon. Bye-bye.